Children in schools around France mobilized on Thursday to mark the International Day Against Violence and Bullying in Schools, as a new UN report highlights that bullying is actually on the rise in the country. Between 2018 and 2022, it rose from 49% to 60% for girls and from 48% to 58% for boys. Cyberbullying is also a concern. According to a recent survey, 15% of primary school children and over 25% of secondary school pupils in France have faced some kind of online attacks through TikTok, messengers and other types of social media platforms. For more, we can speak now with the director of UNESCO's GEM program, Manos Antoninis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, let's start with the alarming trend in France. Despite laws in place to curb school violence, cases are on the rise, particularly among girls. What are the reasons behind this alarming trend then?
Well, it's a very complex issue. And of course, France is not an exception. France is part of a wider global trend that sees increase in bullying and also increases that are higher for girls than for boys. And there are so many social reasons behind it, but the one trend that appears particularly interesting is, of course, the growing use of technology. It appears that girls are far more likely to be active users of social media and also far more likely to be vulnerable to cyberbullying, which is one of course, multiple forms of bullying that exist in classrooms.
So you've mentioned it's online. How is the growing use of social media then playing a role in this?
Well, of course, social media play often on children's fears. It also makes it easier to be less visible in some ways, of course, more visible in others. And in some ways, it has substituted, as I mentioned, boys are more likely to be involved in physical bullying. Girls historically have been more likely to be exposed to psychological bullying. And of course, cyberbullying is precisely a way that is more likely to be effective on a psychological terms.
Psychological terms, indeed. Well, are there any links then between the rise in violence in schools and inequality in education resulting from financial differences among parents?
Well, it's true that bullies tend to be acting from some position of power, however one might call it. I think the worrying thing, and perhaps one can make even some connection to that, is the impact that bullying has on learning outcomes. The 2024-25 Global Education Monitoring Report, from which you quote these numbers, also draws attention to the declining levels of learning outcomes around the rich world, with really very large declines over the last 10 years in reading and mathematics outcomes. And it is difficult to avoid the assumption, although of course it's very difficult to demonstrate because technology is ubiquitous, that the extensive use of technology which has impact also on bullying behaviors and on making some children feel much more vulnerable, it's impossible to dissociate that with the learning trends. And it's known that children who are bullied have actually much lower learning achievement than other children.
So it's a very complicated issue, of course, but what can be done? What needs to be done to fix the problem?
Well, that's a very complex issue, but when it comes to schools and what schools can do, of course, school principals, teachers need to be trained, need to be prepared to deal with this difficult situation. Often teachers prefer to avoid that direct confrontation. It's not easy unless you're really well prepared and well trained. And it requires to be aware, to be vigilant, to be observant. It's not just about teaching, it's about being aware, collecting information from bystanders, from other colleagues at work, from the students, of course, involved, from parents, to not let it be under the carpet, as we say. And it needs to also involve measures that support vulnerable children that often may be not having friends, may be left aside, maybe having less of a voice. These children need to be supported, need to be involved in activities, need to be not left alone, because that makes them, of course, much more obvious targets.
Manos Antoninis from UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report. Thank you so much for your insight.